Chapter 13, Neo Behaviorism. We covered during the last session, Agenda 1, Russian Objective Psychology, John Watson and Behaviorism, William McDougall, and others. Today we look at positivism, logical positivism, Guthrie, Hull, Skinner, Tolman, and the state of behaviorism today. After reading, discussing, and watching videos for Chapter 13, you should understand the ideas and concepts that preceded the development of neo-behaviorism, understand the characteristics of neo-behaviorism, be familiar with Tolman's purposive behaviorism, description, concepts, and impact, and be acquainted with Hull's hypothetico-deductive theory of learning and its influence on psychology. Be familiar with Guthrie's theoretical views on learning in psychology. Understand Skinner's analysis of behavior and its implication and the state of behaviorism today. Positivism, in various forms, had been active around for centuries. It argues that what constitutes appropriate data are observations that are public domain, meaning that others can see them as well. It's important to avoid, or at least minimize, theoretical speculation from the data. Logical positivism, developed by the Vienna Circle, basically said, divided science into empirical and the theoretical. It wedded empiricism and rationalism together. Accepting the theory as part of empirical science, however, did not reduce the importance of empirical observation. Abstract theoretical terms were allowed only if such terms could be logically tied to empirical observations. So we had to have theory, but we also had some way to make them concrete through some sort of observation. They had to be operationalized. So then we look at operationism. The insistence that all abstract scientific terms be operationally defined. An operational definition is the defining of an abstract theoretical concept by the procedures used to measure it. Operational definitions tie theoretical terms to observable phenomena. So, no ambiguity about the definition of the theoretical term. So once operationism was presented, most psychologists agreed with the logical positivists that unless a concept can be operationally defined, it is scientifically meaningless. Physicalism. The desire for the unification of a common vocabulary among the sciences, including psychology. Physicalism. One outcome of logical positivism was that all sciences were viewed as essentially the same, following the same principles, with the same assumptions, and all attempting to explain empirical observations. So why shouldn't they use the same terminology? It sort of put science, all the sciences, on equal footing by developing sort of a common language that could be used. Characteristics. The combination of behaviorism and logical positivism is neo-behaviorism. Though there were major differences among the neo-behaviorists, they all tended to agree on a few important issues. If theories are used, they must be used in ways demanded by logical positivism. They must follow certain rules. All theoretical terms must be operationally defined. Non-human animals should be used as research participants for two reasons. Relevant variables are easier to control in animals than when using human subjects. So we had an issue of control over these subjects, and we had more control over animals more so than human beings. Perceptual and learning processes in non-human animals differ only in degree from those processes in humans. So we can study these non-human animals on these basic processes that are perceptual in nature and learning in nature. So basically the two things are, one, we have greater control over animals, and two, that the perceptual and learning processes are basically the same when it comes down to looking at humans and non-humans. It's just a matter of degree. So learning processes are of prime importance because learning is the primary mechanism by which organisms adjust to a changing environment. They adjust to the environment via learning. Edwin Ray Guthrie, Law of Learning and Contiguity. Stimuli which accompanies a movement will on its reoccurrence tend to be followed by that movement. So again, stimuli which accompanies a movement will on its reoccurrence tend to be followed by that movement. He rejected the law of frequency. The theory rejected the law of frequency employed in various forms by most of all the learning researchers and postulated the possibility of one-trial learning. So the idea was that we had to have things frequently done to us, then we could learn it. What he proposed here was this new idea that we can sometimes learn something on one occurrence, ergo one-trial learning. Now, movements that we mentioned earlier. The distinction between movements and acts. To explain why practice improves, so we practice doing something, we tend to get better at it. So, to explain why practice improves performance, even though one-trial learning occurs, Guthrie distinguished between movements and acts. First, a movement. A movement is a specific response to a configuration of stimuli in which an association is learned at full strength after one exposure. So a specific response to a configuration or arrangement of stimuli in the environment, okay, in which one learns an association. Then we have the act, made up of movements, and a skill is made up of acts. So we have this movement plus movement equals an act, and act plus act plus act, as an example, equals a skill. So we see them breaking down our behavior, what it is that we learn, and how it is that we learn based on these components of movements and acts and skills. Now, reinforcement. Reinforcement changes the stimulus situation and thus preserves the association that preceded the reinforcement condition. Reinforcement changes the stimulus situation and preserves the association that preceded the reinforcement condition. So when reinforcement occurs, the stimulus situation changes, and thus the last response made will not be associated with other situations. And when the situation occurs again, the response will occur again. So we have the situation that leads to a certain type of response. When that situation is there, the response occurs again. Explaining forgetting. It occurs in one trial due to an old stimulus response association being displaced by a new one. So in this case idea, think of an old versus new phone number. Let's say someone asked you for your previous phone number, but you've forgotten it. You've forgotten it because you've made now a new association with the new phone number. So in this instance, the old SR association is being displaced by a new one. Forgetting. Breaking habits. Breaking habits consist of observing the stimuli which elicit the habitual behavior and performing other behavior in the presence of those stimuli. So again, we have observing the stimuli which elicits a certain type of habitual behavior, and we perform other behavior in the presence of those stimuli. By doing so, we can break habits. The effectiveness of punishment, per Guthrie. Determined not by the pain it causes, but by what it causes the organism to do in the presence of stimuli that elicit undesirable behavior. So, determined not by the pain it causes, but by what it causes the organism to do in the presence of stimuli that at one time elicited that undesirable behavior. So if punishment elicits behavior incompatible with the undesirable behavior in the presence of these stimuli, it will be effective. Drives. Drives provide maintaining stimuli that keep an organism active until a goal is reached. These can be internal or external. It attempts to basically explain why drives are happening. Provides maintaining stimuli that keeps an organism active, keeps it driven until the goal is reached. And these can be from external or external forces. Clark Leonard Hull. Hypothetico-deductive theory of learning of Hull. Three important concepts include reinforcement, habit strength, and reaction potential. Influence on the amount of research it produced and the methodology. So he had a great deal of influence in that regard because these were some very great ideas that he proposes. The hypothetico-deductive theory of learning of Hull used intervening variables such as Tolman, but used them more extensively. From summarizing the research on learning, he formed postulates from which he inferred theorems that yielded testable propositions. Hull's intervening variables were primarily physiological, in contrast to the cognitive variables of Tolman, which we'll see a little bit later. So we have these intervening variables, these variables that come between one thing and another thing. So he's looking at these intervening variables which are physiological in nature. His final theory had 17 postulates and over 133 theorems. So the three important concepts that we mentioned include reinforcement, habit strength, and reaction potential. Reinforcement. A biological need creates a drive, and the decreasing of that drive constitutes reinforcement, thus a drive reduction theory of reinforcement. So we have some physiological need, for example, hunger. It causes this tension in us that we find uncomfortable. It drives our behavior. And then the things that we do in order to reduce that drive are going to be reinforced. Ergo, the drive reduction theory of reinforcement. Habit strength. If a response leads to drive reduction, habit strength is increased. So we have a response, a behavior that actually does lead to the reduction of that drive, that tension that we feel that motivates our behavior. Then habit strength is being increased. So operationally defined, habit strength is the number of reinforced pairings between an environmental situation and a response. An increase in habit strength constitutes learning. Reaction potential. The probability that a learned response will occur. It is primarily a function of the amount of drive, the thing that gets us going, the motivating factor, and habit strength, how we associate it with certain outcomes, but is also influenced by other intervening variables. Influence on the amount of research it produced and the methodology. Through Hull's theory has essentially gone away. Its great influence was the amount of research it produced as researchers devised projects to test the theory's predictions and its validity. Now we get to B.F. Skinner. Skinner's positivism essentially was from the Francis Bacon perspective, and to a lesser degree, Ernst Mach. Scientists were to collect empirical facts and then infer knowledge from those facts. They were not to devise theories and then deduce facts from theory. Science is to be descriptive and inductive rather than theoretical and deductive. So basically what we see here is sort of like the old hardcore type of idea of empiricism that we saw and talked about earlier. So from Skinner's perspective, scientists were to collect empirical facts and then infer knowledge from those facts. Now let's look at functional analysis of behavior of Skinner's. An analysis of the relationship between environmental events and behavioral events. So an analysis of the relationship between the environmental events and behavioral events. Internal events, in this regard, have no place in such an analysis. So when it comes to functional analysis of behavior, they're only looking at environmental events which can be observed and behavioral events which can be observed. The internal events, the things that are hidden, that go on in the black box, have no place in such an analysis because they are events also and thus need to be explained. So internal events cannot serve as explanations or causes of behavior. Ergo, they are somewhat irrelevant here. Operant behavior. Now, there are two types of behavior. We discussed one previously, respondent behavior. Was behavior which was related to environmental stimuli, that is reflexive behavior. This was the work that was done by Watson and Pavlov. They were interested in this type of behavior, usually referred to as classical conditioning. Operant behavior is behavior that is influenced by its consequences, and because it operates on the environment in such a way as to produce consequences, he called this behavior operant behavior. Skinner's free operant methodology allows the organism to respond freely in an experimental chamber in which a particular response is reinforced based on prearranged contingencies. The relevant measure is usually the rate of the selected response. Operant conditioning takes place as the behavior of the organism is affected by its consequences. So what the organism does in this situation is going to be based on what it did and the consequences for what it did. And that will start to change the behavior of the organism. Now, reinforcement from Skinner's perspective, the process by which a consequence of a behavior increases the rate or probability of the behavior. Nothing else is necessary to define reinforcement. So again, it is simply the process by which a consequence of a behavior increases the rate or probability of that behavior. Anything that leads to that is a reinforcement. So the reinforcer can be anything as long as its effect is to increase the probability of the behavior that produces the consequence. So we don't necessarily need to have it make sense or be logical to us when somebody's behavior increases. For example, we give a student in an elementary class a bunch of attention by either pointing them out in class, ridiculing them, or even punishing them in some way. We would maybe be affected by it in certain one way that may cause us to have our behavior lessen, go down. But in this case, that child may have that making the behavior go up. So whatever that is, even though it may not make logical sense, if it causes the behavior to go up or increase the rate or probability of that behavior going up, it still serves as a reinforcement. Reinforcement contingencies influence which behaviors are increased and which are not. Change contingencies and you can change behavior. So as we see somebody operate on the environment and then there's a consequence, they operate in the environment, there's a consequence, they operate in the environment and you change that consequence, then that behavior is going to be changed. So change contingencies and you can change behavior. You can modify behavior based on the behavior certain way, and then you provide a certain consequence for that behavior. The selection of behavior by consequences. Darwinian ideas can be applied here. The organism produces a variety of behaviors. So think about it from what we've talked about when it comes to evolution. There's a variety of behaviors that we produce. Some will result in consequences that will increase the behavior. That means things are being reinforced. So we do some sort of behavior and it reinforces that behavior. These effective behaviors will be selected to be part of the organism's repertoire, while others will not. So those behaviors which continually get reinforced, they remain. Those behaviors that do not get reinforced, they go away. Okay? Simple. Reinforcement versus punishment. Reinforcement of behavior exerted a much better control over behavior than punishment of behavior. So basically what it comes down to here is always better to reinforce desirable behavior as opposed to punishing undesirable behavior. One of the key things here, a key difference, is when you reinforce desirable behavior, you have given them, the organism, an example of what you want them to do, and then you give them the proper consequence for it. So Skinner's position was non-theoretical. Operationism is important, but he rejected the theoretical aspects of logical positivism, was content to manipulate environmental events and observe the effects on behavior. That's all he wanted to do. All right. So he was not keen on this theoretical aspects of logical positivism. He was looking totally at environmental events and behavioral events. So he was content to manipulate environmental events and observe the effects on behavior. This functional analysis is all that is necessary according to Skinner. His approach was called descriptive behaviorism. Now, when it comes to B.F. Skinner, we know, and we've discussed this, I believe, there are many ways in which we have utilized the work of B.F. Skinner. Applications go from education, okay, as well as behavior therapy, as well as organizations. Okay, so when people in an organization behave a certain way, perform good work, and get merit on that, they may be provided with certain consequences which hopefully reinforce those behaviors. So from education, he criticized the use of punishment rather than manipulation of reinforcement contingency. So the idea here, reinforcement is better over punishment. When it comes to behavior therapy, treatment is a matter of removing reinforcers of abnormal behavior and arranging reinforcement contingencies so that they strengthen desirable behavior. For example, token economies. Really quickly, what a token economy is, for example, let's imagine you're working at an institute where people actually live. So you have patients, maybe children, some of which may be autistic and some from other types of elements. And the idea here is that in order to implement consequences and contingencies that we would like to have, we want to implement token economies there. We give them, for example, tokens for good behavior. So if they behave well in classrooms and other types of areas, they receive tokens. If they don't behave well, then those tokens may be taken away. So we implement this type of economies within these institutes in order to give us more ways to control and to modify their behavior. Now, for Edward Chase Tolman. He studied purposive and molar behavior, or goal-directed behavior. Studied purposive behavior in contrast to molecular behavior that was seen with Watson. At Harvard, Tolman learned to study purposive aspects of behavior without sacrificing scientific objectivity. Done this by seeing purpose in behavior itself rather than inferring purpose from the behavior. So purpose was in the behavior. The behavior had a purpose itself rather than inferring some sort of purpose from the behavior. So he used rats to avoid introspection. Tolman saw the use of rats as an experimental subject as a way of guarding against even the possibility of indirect introspection that could occur if humans were used as experimental participants. Okay, the idea here, they're assessing their the stimuli that are being presented to them and maybe adding something to it. In order to remove that as a possibility, he used rats as experimental subjects. So, what we mean by intervening variables here. Intervening variables. Variables that intervene between environmental events and behavior. So we have the environmental situation or events, okay, and then there is something, we'll call it intervening variable, and then there is a behavior. Okay? Employing logical positivism, he tied all intervening variables to observable behavior. He operationally defined all theoretical terms. Again, this is key to the whole idea of logical positivism. Tolman's intervening variables were cognitive processes, unlike Hall, which we saw earlier when it comes to like those physiological drives. So Tolman's intervening variables were cognitive processes which are influential in determining behavior. For example, having hypotheses or expectations or having beliefs, okay, or in some instances, having a visual map in one's mind. All of these represent an intervening variables which are cognitive processes in nature. Now, Tolman disagreed with Watson and Thorndike's explanation of learning. Tolman believed that learning occurs constantly with or without reinforcement and with or without motivation. So basically, we're always learning. We're always are in a mode of learning. There doesn't have to be some sort of reinforcement for it. There doesn't have to be some sort of motivation behind it. We are always learning. So he did make a distinction between learning and performance, however. Learning takes place constantly as the organism simply interacts with their environment. You are learning just by being in X environment, okay? Whether the organism uses what it has learned is determined, however, by something else. It's determined by its motivational states. In other words, whether the organism performs the learned behavior is based on whether it is motivated to do so or not. So the idea here is this, simply put. We could learn something, okay, again, without necessarily being reinforced with or without some sort of motivation behind it. We learn something, but we never demonstrate that learning until there is something that motivates us to do so. Up until that point, it's just the possibility that we've learned something. We haven't proven it yet unless we are motivated to actually act on the things that we learned and demonstrate it in some way. So performance, from Tolman's perspective, is the translation of learning into behavior. So we learn something, and it just sits there. And then when we actually do something about it, when we perform it, that is the translation of learning into a behavior. Now, this brings up the idea of latent learning. Okay, the idea that we may learn something, but we do not have the ability to display it or reveal it to someone unless we have some sort of motivation to do so. So up until that point, it may be latent learning. Tolman and Hanzik showed that learning remained latent until the organism had a reason to use it, which was an incentive. So up until the point we have a motivation factor, some sort of thing to initiate us to demonstrate the behavior, it really doesn't matter. We really don't show or reveal the learning has taken place. So here we have practice trials, which we serve as an independent variable, and errors, which serves as the dependent variable. We have the average errors on the left, and at the bottom we have trials, one trial per day. And as we can see, the average level of errors is kind of high, and as we have more trials, the average errors tend to go down and down. So we can see it's really low at 10 and gets slightly lower at 17 trials. So theoretically, an internal state of, quote, learning intervened between the independent variable of practice trials and the dependent variable of errors. So learning is the intervening variable. So listen to this. It was the state, it was this state, learning, that caused errors to decrease, not the practice trials. Okay? So from a strictly behaviorist point of view, all we know is that we had practice trials. Okay, more practice trials, and then we had fewer errors. What we're saying here, however, is this: that there is this intervening state, this state of learning, this intervening variable of learning. It was this state that caused the errors to decrease, not the practice trials. So the intervening variable in operational definitions. So we have the operational definition, we have practice trial, and that is the independent variable, the number of practice trials. The operational definition of errors, how many errors we saw committed during this particular trial. We see this as the dependent variable. And in the middle, we have the intervening variable of learning. So intervening variables are studied by means of operational definitions, which are descriptions of procedures that are assumed to have some link to the internal state. In this case, the internal state again being learning. Behaviorism today. Skinner remains the most influential of all the behaviorists, has a great impact, and one of the reasons that we probably think so highly of the work that Skinner did is that we see this not only in a variety of industries today, in education today, we also see it in our homes as we're raising our children and things of that nature. Or if you're being raised, you remember too, you behave a certain way, and the parents provided you some sort of consequence for those behaviors. And this is key and cornerstone to behaviorism that Skinner proposed. Behaviorism and Neo Behaviorism have lost some influence today. There are other factors, evidence of genetic influence on behavior, and there's lots of criticism on logical positivism in many regards. But the major legacy of behaviorism is that psychologists generally now agree that the subject matter of psychology is overt behavior. Not totally dismissing the other aspects of it, but behavior is key. When someone goes to a therapist, oftentimes it's trying to modify some sort of behavior, okay, something that they are behaving or doing something they don't like, they want to do less of, or behaviors they want to do more of. Okay, but behavior is going to be key to many of the things that we focus on today by way of therapy, as well as behaviorism in areas such as education and industry and things of that nature. All right, that's all I wanted to talk about when it comes to Neo Behaviorism and behaviorism, wrapping those ideas up. But also, we have to just talk about our essay assignments for batch number 2. These essays will be due on April 17th. So let me go over these real quickly here so you have some familiarity with them. So again, like last time, you're going to select one of the essay topics from options that are provided to you. So select one of the essay topic options below to complete this assignment. And I want to emphasize this time, you are highly encouraged to use several sources in the construction of your essay. These sources should be cited and properly referenced in your essay. So here are some of the options. Option D that I have here, I don't know why I had D. I think the last one ended at C. But option D, what is the Clever-Hans phenomenon and what are its implications for psychological experimentation? This was covered primarily in Chapter 9. What we should do is discuss relevant ideas and concepts as appropriate in your essay. We can also look at things such as anthropomorphism, blind to double-blind procedures, experimentation procedures, and so on. Option E. Describe 3 ways that Münsterberg contributed to what we now call applied psychology. This was primarily discussed in Chapter 11. Discuss relevant ideas and concepts as appropriate in your essay. For example, the treatments of mental disorders, legal concerns, marketing, and issues in the workplace. And then option F. Compare and contrast the 2 approaches to behaviorism advanced by Watson and McDougall. This was covered in Chapter 12. Discuss relevant ideas and concepts as appropriate in your essay, looking at such things as goals of psychology, internal and external causes of behavior, instincts, and so on. All right, that's it for today.